You're listening to a podcast from the BBC World Service. This is Hardtalk with me, Stephen Sacker. Thanks for downloading this edition of the programme. I do hope you enjoy it. Welcome to Hardtalk on the BBC World Service with me, Stephen Sacker. There's always a troubling question that hangs over the grim fallout from a terrorist attack like the one seen in Brussels just days ago. Where next? Where will the extremist followers of the so-called Islamic State go next with their homemade bombs, their suicide belts, and grim intent to inflict maximum damage on civilian targets? In the words of the French President François Hollande, Europe is now at war. So how best to fight back? Certainly, this is no conventional military confrontation. More important than firepower is intelligence. And intelligence requires understanding, patience, and international cooperation. And politics matters too. How do Europeans maintain their core values, freedom, democracy, respect for individual privacy, while prioritising collective security? My guest is well versed in this debate. Dominic Grieve was, until 2014, Attorney General in David Cameron's British government. He chairs the Intelligence and Security Committee in the Westminster Parliament. At a time of severe threat, does Europe have to sacrifice elements of freedom to maximise security? Welcome to Hardtalk.
Thank you.
Europe right now seems to be in a very difficult place. Intensely aware of the threat posed by the Islamic State jihadists, but seemingly unable to root it out.
It's a real problem, and I think Europe, we are collectively facing a serious crisis. We've seen it going on for some time. The region around Europe is seriously disturbed. There are threats to peace. So there's no doubt that we need to work together in order to tackle those problems. And we also have to accept that the problems, particularly of terrorism, are not amenable to simple solutions. We may have to live with the threat of terrorism for some time. What's clearly important is that we should preserve our values, which are those of democracy and freedom, that we should try to make sure that nothing we do undermines them, because this is a values battle with terrorists, and that we take sensible steps to protect ourselves. And the best way of doing that, I have very little doubt, is by reinforcing the cooperation between different countries.
You, thanks to your role in Parliament, are allowed to see a lot of secret documents and a lot of information that I and anybody else in this country is not privy to. I want your assessment of just how little, in a sense, we know about the nature of the Islamic State and associated threat in this country and across Europe today.
Clearly, as has often been said, there are unknown unknowns. So what we don't know about, we don't know about. But I think we have a picture of what has been going on. The Islamic State in the Middle East has been using its base in Raqqa and Mosul as a place from which to foment terrorism. And it is doing that by radicalising or calling upon individuals living in Western societies in Western Europe to take action.
And that's the point in a way. It's not so much, I mean, we know, as you say, about Raqqa, we know about the degree to which this so-called caliphate has established a presence across a swathe of territory in Syria and Iraq. But what we don't know, and what the Belgians in particular appear incapable of penetrating, is the scale, the strength, the resilience of the network of activists, followers, sympathisers of these jihadists inside Europe's biggest cities, most important cities, like Brussels, like Paris.
I don't have any specialist knowledge of what's going on in Brussels, and I must emphasise that. I mean, certainly looking at it from a United Kingdom angle, I think that our security services are able to build up a picture of the extent of radicalisation and of who might be a threat. But that's not to say that it can ever be a 100% picture. There is always the possibility of somebody slipping through the net, whether it's here or in Brussels, which is why I'm always a little bit wary of being overcritical of alleged failures by other intelligence services in foreign countries. Although clearly, the more coordinated we are, the more we share information, and the more likely it is that we will pick up threats before they translate into action.
Home Secretary here in the UK, Theresa May, she says there have been 14 plots by Islamic State and associated groups on UK soil since the start of 2014. Now, thankfully, they've been thwarted, but that does suggest there are a significant number of people committed to extremist violence in this country. Can you put any number on it? Give me a sense of the scale that you were hearing about.
I don't think I can put a number on it, but I think it's important not to start thinking that we're talking of thousands of people. Only a very small number of people, if they're sufficiently dedicated to this, can cause mayhem. So I don't think we should suddenly get it into our heads that there are thousands of people living in British society who wish to commit acts of violence against their fellow citizens. That's not to say that the numbers are tiny, they're not. Consistently, there have been suggestions by the police that we're talking of the high hundreds or very low, that sort of figure. And I have no reason to think that that's wrong. And clearly, that's not just the individuals who might be doing things, but those are also the people who are immediately around them or who have knowledge of what they're doing. So I think we mustn't exaggerate the problem either. The vast majority, for example, of Muslims living in the United Kingdom are entirely peaceful, desire to integrate, and absolutely abhor what's going on.
That is an important point. I dare say the vast majority of refugees and migrants who are coming out of Syria also are entirely peaceable and want nothing but to find safety for themselves and their families. But there is an issue when one talks about the people coming out of Syria, about whether there could also be extremists posing a danger to Western countries. Some countries, thinking of Poland, have just announced that they're no longer prepared to take any quota. They were going to take 7,000. They're no longer prepared to take any of the Syrian refugees who are to be distributed through the European Union. Does that seem to you to be a sensible response?
I'm not sure it necessarily is, because I don't think that the vast majority of refugees fleeing Syria have any evil intent towards the countries to which they're fleeing whatsoever. Of course, it's possible that amongst the flow coming out from Syria, there may be people who've been planted by Daesh, IS, with a specific task of
well, never mind possible. We know it's true, frankly, because in Paris, at least one of the bombers was able to travel through Europe as a part of the refugee flow. And we know now that the Turks warned of one individual who came out of Syria, was picked up by the Turks, then went to Holland and then to Belgium, and both governments, the Dutch and the Belgians, were warned by the Turks this man was a potential danger. They did nothing about it, and he was involved in the bombings in Brussels.
So I understand, and that would appear to be a failure of either intelligence sharing or acting upon intelligence. But as I say, it doesn't concern the United Kingdom, so I've only seen what I've read in the media. But I think it's important to emphasise that the majority of people that we have had in this country have been self-radicalising. That's to say they've been second or third generation immigrants in this country. They haven't come out of the flow from Syria. So to suddenly get into one's head, oh well, we stopped the flow from Syria and suddenly our problems are going to go away, I don't think that that is correct. As far as one can make out, the cells which have been active in France and in Belgium appear to be individuals of Moroccan origin who've in fact been settled as families in Western Europe for some time. Now, that's not to say that some of them may not have been out to Syria. That's also possible. But I think it highlights the point that to get into one's mind the idea that people fleeing Syria are a threat to us in this country, some special threat, or to Western Europe, because many of them might be terrorists, there's no evidence to sustain that.
Well, let's flip it around then, because earlier you made the point of saying, look, the vast majority of Muslims who live in communities in the UK, and I dare say across Europe too, are, again, peace-loving people who want nothing but security for themselves and their families. But the fact is, as you've just alluded to, when we have seen examples of terrorist activity in the UK, you know, there have been extremists who found cover inside Muslim communities in the UK. How do you penetrate best those communities to bring out the intelligence necessary to nail those people?
The Home Secretary made the point yesterday, quite correctly, that as far as she was concerned, she didn't consider that the Muslim community and Muslim communities in the United Kingdom were wanting in coming forward, where they feared that people were involved with Daesh.
So the French intelligence official Philippe Hayes, who says, we're talking about guerrilla terrorism here in Europe, and there is a population that is complicit. We are, he says, in a situation of structural vulnerability. You don't see it that way.
Looking at the United Kingdom context, I don't necessarily disagree with his analysis, but it's all a matter of degree. Abundantly clear that there are individuals in this country who wish us harm. And I also entirely accept that around them there will be others who may be on the way to radicalisation, or may just turn a blind eye, or may have extreme views, who may in fact provide some of the sustenance that surrounds these groups. But I think that's in reality rather a small number of people. Outside of that is the vast, broad swathe of Muslims living in the United Kingdom who are wholly removed from this.
There an onus upon them, that vast, broad swathe, to engage more with the authorities to safeguard against activities of this very small number of extremists.
There's an onus on them, but there's actually an onus on all of us. I mean, there is a wider issue of integration. I'm currently chairing a commission for Citizens UK on the participation of Muslims in public life in the United Kingdom. We know there are difficulties in respect of this. And these are not just one way, they operate both ways. So the integration of some Muslim communities into the United Kingdom, for that matter elsewhere in Europe, has undoubtedly proved challenging. And that's an issue which is about values.
I'm just, in my mind, I'm hearing the words of Donald Trump. I mean, the Donald Trump approach to this, admittedly in the United States, not in Europe, but his approach is to say, forget about being politically correct anymore. Forget about all this nonsense of not treading on people's toes and being committed to full equality on everything. He says, for a start, you know, in the US, we're not going to let Muslims travel here from now on, and we're going to be much, much tougher in the way we deal with these communities.
But these are simplistic absurdities, and they're also extremely damaging and corrosive and unpleasant. They are going to do nothing towards solving some of the longer-term problems. Two things that need to be done is, one, to try to tackle the terrorists. In a sense, that's the government's prevent strategy. And also to reinforce the values of what a liberal, democratic, free society, which is pluralistic and multicultural, should be trying to achieve. Lots of people respond positively to that, but we as politicians, and this is right across the mainstream, undoubtedly there is a duty on us to do more. And that I've always considered to be one of the most important things and priorities for us all.
In this conversation, you made a point of differentiating between Britain and France and Belgium, as we've been talking about them. Do you think the European Union and its various security and intelligence institutions enhance or hinder the security of Europe?
Everything I've seen suggests that they enhance the security of Europe.
Freedom of movement? That enhances the security of Europe?
Freedom of movement is not about security. Freedom of movement is about our European partners having decided under the Schengen arrangement, which doesn't concern us directly, that they wanted to remove all border controls.
Quite. What it means is there are no internal borders, there are no police checking passports across the
decision,
whole...
just as there aren't across states of the United States. Now, whether they are wise to continue with that in the face of the current level of terrorism is a debate for them.
Ronald Noble, former head of Interpol, he says Schengen and the freedom of movement that we've just discussed, borderless travel inside the European Union, it is like hanging a sign welcoming terrorists into Europe.
Yes, but the question you asked me was relating particularly to our own security here. We are not affected by that directly because we are not part of Schengen. Clearly, if our European partners wish to restore border controls, and indeed some of them have, it looks as if Schengen may well have to be modified. I entirely accept that if you don't have border controls, then the ability of terrorists to move from France to Hungary or through Germany, there is going to be nothing that is going to pick up those movements. That's one of the reasons why the United Kingdom chose not to participate.
But wouldn't we be even safer if we no longer had EU passports? You know, if it was quite clear that we were a distinct territory, completely distinct from the European Union?
I find it difficult to see where the advantage would lie. At the moment, we can check passports of anybody coming into this country. The Home Secretary, even if it's an EU national, can prevent somebody coming in if she has credible evidence that that person may be involved in extremism or terrorism and deem them to be a person whose presence is not conducive to the public good. We can exclude such people. It's open to potential challenge, but that's not to say that the challenge will succeed. Ultimately, what Europe offers us is a cooperation mechanism through Europol, the policing, and Eurojust, the prosecutors' alliance.
Sir Richard Dearlove, former security intelligence chief, says Europol's basically useless. A leaky colander, he says. It's only as good as the weakest link in the 28 member state security fence. And frankly, some of those 28 member states are extremely weak.
I certainly agree with him that some of the member states will have weak security. They're countries without the sort of tradition of being able to have a security system.
So we're not going to share any real significant intelligence with them, are they? Leaky colander, he said.
With some, it would be difficult to share intelligence, but then by participating within these European structures, we can actually set out to try to improve their performance. But where I think Sir Richard may be wrong is that he retired from the intelligence world in 2004. And I do think that in the intervening period, there has been quite a lot of progress in respect of data sharing and intelligence sharing at policing level across the European Union.
I mean, you learned what happened between the Belgians and the French after the Bataclan and other attacks in November of last year. You know how poor the cooperation was. Why do you say that you're now confident this really works on a pan-European basis?
I'm saying it is better than not having it, which is the point. The question you asked me was, were we better off out? And the answer is, how would withdrawing from the European Union improve our national security? And that, I have to say, I simply do not see. That's not to say that the European systems we operate under are perfect or can't do with improvement. We do a lot of intelligence sharing with our European partners, particularly our key partners.
If I may say so, we do a darn sight more with the English-speaking world. The so-called Five Eyes ultimate level of intelligence sharing for the UK government involves the United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. That in itself sends a very clear message about whom we in the UK believe we can really trust.
I think, if I may say so, I think that is a slightly simplistic approach to the issue. There's no doubt that our Five Eyes partners are a long, trusted and very well-ordered relationship. It's very important for our national security. It's very important for global security. But when it comes to the issue of how do we tackle terrorist cells which may be across the European Union, it's abundantly clear that our closest cooperation is going to be with those countries which are most directly affected and with those countries of the European area which can best provide us with assistance.
I know you are, on the whole, a fan of European institutions. The Belgian Prime Minister now says it's time for a European CIA. Would you go that far?
I think that might present some problems in relation to what you share. I don't necessarily think that that's the solution. I certainly don't think that all is perfect. It isn't. But there are mechanisms for sharing policing information which is vital to our national security. The Chief Commissioner of Police for the metropolis has said so. Everything I know about this suggests to me that it's of great importance. And intelligence sharing is a rather different issue. That is often, I'm sure, done at a bilateral level, but the mechanisms within the EU are helpful to our cooperation. There is, for example, a committee that meets regularly of heads of internal security services, and that includes MI5.
But it's telling, isn't it, that Britain is intent right now on going further than the European Union appears to be ready to go, at least pre the Brussels bombs, in terms of surveillance, electronic mass surveillance. Now, you've been intimately involved in this debate in the United Kingdom about exactly how far the government should push its quote-unquote investigatory powers legislation. Given the security situation we've talked about today, do you believe the government has got the balance right with its insistence there must be sweeping new electronic surveillance powers?
The committee of which I'm a chairman was absolutely clear, both in its earlier report before the last election and its follow-up report, that the powers that the government is seeking to set out in the legislation, the areas it wishes to cover, are necessary and proportionate to maintaining our national security. And it's wrong to think that what it is seeking to do is to provide an ability of general surveillance of communications to our agencies, in particular GCHQ. This is utterly removed from reality. It's not what GCHQ does, and it's not what GCHQ intends to do.
But
if it were to do it, it would be
web
unlawful.
browsing records of ordinary people for up to a year?
The question is about the capability of the agencies to be able to access important data if they need it. That's an entirely different thing from carrying out mass surveillance of the population, because that's not what they're doing. But if the data isn't available for them to look at and to search, then they can't.
You think in the wake of Edward Snowden and everything he revealed about the extent of secret surveillance, that the public are going to be satisfied with what you've just said?
Well, interesting.
I mean, you said yourself not so very long ago, you said, given the background of this, the concern over the allegations made by Edward Snowden, it is, quote you, surprising that the protection of people's privacy enshrined in other legislation doesn't feature more prominently in this draft legislation.
Well, we certainly put forward our view that it would have been better to have an overarching privacy clauses within the legislation.
And will you still push for that?
I very much hope that the government will respond positively to what we've suggested. As I said when I addressed the House at second reading of this legislation, when it first came before Parliament, one's got to be careful. Some of it may have a slightly symbolic aspect to it, but I do think an overarching privacy clause, it was the committee's view, would be better than the way it's been dealt with in this legislation. But that's an entirely different thing from saying that the legislation in terms of the areas of power that the government wants to take isn't needed. It is.
And in the end, what's really important is who decides when these powers can be assumed by the government. Now, there's been a lot of debate about the extent of the judicial lock that is put upon these powers. Do you believe that now the judiciary, the judicial authority, is sufficient to ensure that ministers can't ride roughshod over privacy?
The shift that's been put forward of having a double lock mechanism on the majority of the exercise of the majority of these powers is a very significant change. And it does give me great confidence that the ability of a judge to review the ministerial decision of granting a warrant provides an extremely important safeguard to these powers being abused. We pressed this I personally have pressed this very hard, and I'm very pleased to see it in the legislation.
Isn't there something missing from all of this debate about how Europe best responds to the security threat posed by jihadist extremism? In the end, as long as there is this war in Syria, as long as the jihadists are making new inroads in countries like Libya, there is no way that we can extinguish the threat in Europe. That's the truth, isn't it?
Yes, it is. We don't have 100% security, and as long
as... But nor do we
have
a coherent policy in Syria or in Libya.
There's no doubt that there are issues over what Western policy may be in Syria or Libya. In Libya, we've recently signed up to providing much greater help to the new government, the new national government, which is recognised by the United Nations. I'm very pleased to see that. And in Syria, there is a strategy, but I have to say it is a strategy which has proved to be very challenging to implement, partly because of the attitude of Russia. And secondly, of course, because of the vote that took place in the House of Commons in the last Parliament on whether we should take any military action to restrain the worst excesses of President Assad. Yes. We are where we are. And I have to say, I do worry. I look at the state of the Middle East, and the anxiety is that if you deal with one problem, another one is going to surface. The Middle East is in a state of severe chaos. There are some countries that are surviving. Many of them are descending into a very dark place, and that is going to present challenges for us. We are on their doorstep.
So when President Hollande talks about a war, this is a war, frankly, that right now has no end.
History shows that periods of great disturbance of this kind will come to an end eventually, but they're not going to come to... I certainly don't think they're going to come to an end speedily.
Dominic Grieve, thank you for being on Hardtalk. That was an edition of Hardtalk presented by me, Stephen Sacker. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.